This is Hollisa Alewine. Welcome back to our continuing investigation into Pharisee, friend, or foe. In this segment, what we want to do is look at some of the Judaisms of the first century and see maybe a little overview of what they believed or how they functioned within that first century era of Roman domination, and maybe how they interacted with one another. Sometimes they would ally themselves with one another. Sometimes they would turn on one another. I suppose like any religious and political history of any period. But without understanding the dynamics, sometimes we don't understand the groups and why Yeshua would say a particular thing to a person from a particular group or to a group of people. And so it helps to at least get an overview, if you've never studied what people believed, to take a look at the basic groups, understanding that there's more things out there, and we don't want to fall into that trap of, again, painting all Jews with a broad brush. That's the temptation. It's even tempting to paint the Judeans as being remarkably different from the Galileans, and I've read some materials that tried to accentuate that difference, and there were distinct differences between the Jews in the area of Judea and the Jews from the Galilee. However, if we continue reading, if we have some academic integrity and we continue reading the sources, then we see that we cannot say that this one statement describes this whole group. We have to say that there's overlap, that there's crossover, and there's exceptions. Maybe there's pockets of people in certain places who do practice differently. Right now, if you met somebody from a foreign country who had never been to America and they said, well, what are Americans like? Answer that one in 5 sentences or less. You can't. And so likewise, we have to be careful about stereotyping or painting with that broad brush all Jews of the first century. They're going to be just like us. They're going to have religious groups, political groups, geographic affiliation, and so forth. And so we have to allow them to be just as human as we are. So let's look at some of these groups, and I've got a little more information in the book, but you've got a general understanding, if you've read the Gospels, that there's different groups at play there. One of those groups is the Sadducees. And the Sadducees, something that we can say about them is that at the time of Yeshua, they were in control of the temple. They had formed that economic and political alliance with Rome. And in some respects, they were puppets of Rome. And in other respects, Rome was being influenced by the Sadducees. So in Hebrew, it would be the Tzaddikim, although I probably wouldn't have chosen Tzaddikim to describe them. However, in terms of their doctrine or what did they believe was true, they thought that only the laws of the Torah were authoritative. In other words, the prophets didn't carry the same weight. They rejected the resurrection of the dead as unprovable in the Torah. Now, if we get over into the prophets, like say Daniel or Isaiah, then the doctrine of the resurrection is very clear. But if you're a Sadducee and you're really only accepting Genesis through Deuteronomy as authoritative, even though the resurrection truly is in every Torah portion in some way, if you over-literalize it, then you can see where the absence of that express doctrine of resurrection, they might say that you can't prove the resurrection in the Torah. I think you can. The Pharisees thought that you could. And we'll look at those proof texts of the resurrection through the Hebrew Scriptures so that you can see where the Pharisees were coming from when they argued for the resurrection of the dead. The Pharisees, although they had the hearts of the common people, the Sadducees were very influential among the rich. And that might have been why they had such a close alliance with Rome, because Rome was known for harsher impositions of judgment and punishment for the criminal. And the Sadducees tended, we're going to be careful with our words, tended to have more wealth, and therefore they were more concerned with criminal justice so that people weren't stealing their stuff. They did not believe in soul immortality, even to the point like the Essenes, they at least acknowledge, the continuation of the soul beyond death. They weren't really on the same page always as whether the body was going to encapsulate the soul once again. Some of them saw it as just being free from this chain of the body. The Sadducees don't believe in soul immortality at all. And because they don't, they denied rewards and punishments in judgment after death. So whereas we have always taken for granted that there will be a judgment at the throne after death and that people will be rewarded according to the way that they've lived their lives, not to be confused with salvation, but to be a part of that resurrection process. A Sadducee is not even going to listen to you talk about anything that might occur in the afterlife, because to them there isn't one. You just fall asleep and that's it. You're done. But they did dominate the priesthood in the first century. So politically and religiously, you probably weren't going to accomplish much without their help. The Essenes, and I believe later, in a later segment, we'll go through a passage in the Gospels where it looks as though Yeshua has turned on a group of Jews, it says, who believed in him. And all of a sudden he whoops around here and starts calling them serpents and horrible things to them. You say, what happened here? I thought they believed. Well, you have to read the full context of what's happening in the exchange. And again, avoid painting with a broad brush. He's already told you that there's a group sitting there that believe in him. But when this other person speaks up, all of a sudden, his whole manner changes. And that's when you have to understand the context of his answer. He would never make that answer to a Pharisee. Not in 1,000 years. So that tells you that the audience has changed. Most likely culprit is going to be Sadducees, because they don't believe in the resurrection of the dead. And they start challenging him about, wait a minute, you're not 50 years old and you've seen Abraham? Seriously? Well, they don't believe that Abraham's still alive. And they certainly don't believe that Yeshua could have met or seen Abraham. So you have to know who the audience is, and don't pin that on the Pharisees. They would have been sitting there like, go Yeshua, you get them. Because, why? They believe in an afterlife. They believe that he's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. To this day. And so, with the Sadducees, sometimes knowing what they believed or what they didn't believe is the key to unlocking that particular dialogue that Yeshua might be having. Another group was called the Essenes, and this is the group that gave us the Dead Sea Scrolls. The thing to remember about them, they were great librarians. They had a copy of everything in their library, whether they believed in it or not. That's one thing that scholars have figured out, is when you find a Dead Sea Scroll, it doesn't necessarily represent their belief or their practice. You can't say of any particular Dead Sea Scroll with certainty that this is exactly what the Essenes did or believed, any more than you could go down to your local library, check out a book on witchcraft, and say that's what your whole town believed in. They were great librarians. And so even trying to understand how they believed in the resurrection, they did believe in the immortality of the soul. But some of them, we can't say with certainty all of them, they tended to believe that the soul was just chained to a body, but it's going to be released. It's going to experience this freedom after death, and then it's going to attain a higher existence. And it was very Platonic. It was the same doctrine as taught by the Greek philosopher Plato. However, we don't want to fall into that trap of painting all the Essenes with that broad brush, because some of the literature says, yes, they did believe in a similar resurrection as the Pharisees. We know that during a difficult period in history, some of the Pharisees left the house of Hillel and moved in, went down to the Dead Sea area with the Essenes. They're at Qumran. So they were Pharisees, but then they became Essenes. And even today, maybe even you, how many times have you crossed into a different denomination or practice of your faith? As you gained new information and so forth, as you transformed, then you may have changed denominations or the way that you practice your faith. Maybe you might be in a place where you don't want any name or denomination. But you can see the same way that we are today is the way that they were in the first century. They could cross over. Sometimes they were seeking more, just like we are. And so even today, people have trouble with us. Jews today might perceive us as Christians, and Christians might see us as Messianic or Hebrew roots, or maybe they still think we're Christian because of our identification with Yeshua. The labels keep moving around, and it's even hard to label ourselves, which is why maybe people have given up trying. Or we may identify ourselves differently. Nazarenes, Hebrew roots, Messianic Jews. There's all sorts of stuff out there. And that same difficulty in the first century. So you can sympathize with them a little bit. If you were to say, what are you? They may have changed affiliations as well. In our situation, just like theirs, it's very fluid. In fact, a great example is Yeshua's own disciples. We're kind of a mixed group of people. But even Josephus, and I know you've heard of Josephus, he's a Jewish historian, and even though he was pretty much on the Roman payroll at the time he wrote his histories, he had a background of, we would today call it church hopping. And so he writes about some of these groups, like the Sadducees. He calls the Sadducees boorish and rude, even with one another. And he says the Sadducees had the confidence of the rich, but he doesn't say the Sadducees were all rich men. He just seems to have a bad attitude about the Sadducees. But the thing to remember about Josephus goes back to who wrote it. He did a little stint as a Pharisee. So you can see that he's got a little animosity there toward the Sadducees. He says they're boorish and rude, but it sounds to me like, well, that could also be a stereotype, because maybe they weren't all boorish and rude, but because he was a former Pharisee, he had to slip that one in there. We know that with the Essenes, they withdrew, whereas the Pharisees may have disagreed with the policies of Rome or the policies of the Sadducees who controlled the temple. They didn't withdraw from the people. They were still very much a part of social life in Judea and even up into the Galilee. The Essenes, on the other hand, completely withdrew. They wanted to have nothing to do with the temple services, because the the lineage that a priest had to have. There was violation of that going on. It had become an economic, political position as much as religious, so they just completely withdrew from that. Was that the right thing to do? Yeshua didn't. So we have to look at Yeshua as the example. Yeshua continued to go and to worship at the temple, and so did his disciples. So just because it was corrupt, he didn't completely withdraw. Instead, he spoke into it. I'm sure had he been around much longer, they would have asked him to leave. But it's like with the disciples and the apostles. Eventually, they had to go on the run because their message was so different. As it developed over time, there just wasn't any room for them at the temple. However, under James, Yaakov, under his leadership in Jerusalem, we know that the Jews who believed on Yeshua did continue to worship at the temple. So apparently there were good times and bad times. So again, we see the danger of saying, this is the way it was. Sometimes it was this way, sometimes it was that way. The Essenes basically just waited out in the wilderness for a messianic figure to come. Scholars can't really agree on what they expected as a messianic figure. There's lots of literature to read out there, lots of commentary. But basically their philosophy was withdrawal, purification. Again, they've been stereotyped as being so pure that they didn't even allow women within their communities, but archaeology has proven that they did. There were women as part of those communities. And what's maybe the funniest thing about the Essenes is the scrolls were discovered. As the scrolls began to be decoded, jumping too soon, scholars began to say, this is what the Essenes were, this is what they did, this is what they believed. But as they open more scrolls, they're going to see it's just like everything else we've said. You can't say with a broad brush, this is the way that they were. Because what they may have actually found was more like a library copy of something, not what the Essenes actually practiced. Or not necessarily even what somebody like Josephus would have reported. If he wasn't part of that community on a continuing basis, things change. You know, you give something 10, 20 years, practices will change. We have the scribes, or in Hebrew it would be the soferim. And this was an important, they weren't a sect so much as they were an occupation. You could be a scribe, but also be a Pharisee. You could be a scribe, you could also be a Sadducee. Because those defined belief and doctrine. But as a scribe, it was your job to transcribe. Like you take this Torah scroll and you copy it. And so they were considered the experts on the literal text. They would know if you made a mistake in quoting something, and it was their job to correct that. They were very reliable copyists, and we know this from surviving manuscripts, that the Hebrew text was very reliable due to the scribes. They were very wise. They had to have been to have that level of literacy, and they had to preserve every jot and every tittle. They had to be consulted. If there was damage to a Torah scroll, you know how easy it would be if one little dot somehow got rubbed out. If one little piece of a letter, it can turn it into an entirely different letter. So they had to be consulted, or perhaps the parchments today, like in a mezuzah, in a kosher, there's a kosher parchment that goes inside a mezuzah on a doorpost, and those, if they're kosher, they have to be written by a certified scribe. But they were very trusted in terms of validating the literal text. It doesn't mean they weren't occasionally in cahoots with other groups. And there's one last thing before we get into the separation of the two houses of Hillel and Shammai, which is vital, and so especially concerning prophecy and the Gentiles. Because one of those groups, one of those houses, is very closely aligned with almost everything Yeshua is teaching. But this last group I want to talk about, it's not a group of people. It's a tool that people used, primarily the Pharisees. And that tool is Jewish literature. It's also called Agadah. And we would say an Agadah is a story. It's a biblical story. But you're not necessarily expected to believe the story is true. And I think this is where some people stumble a little bit if they begin to read Jewish Agadah without any sort of introduction or understanding about what they're reading. They will definitely think Jews are making up stories about stuff that happened in the Bible. But they will use the biblical text to teach a principle, but it's not always something you're supposed to think is actually true. Or whether it's true or not is irrelevant. You say, how can it be irrelevant? I'll give you an example. Yeshua is asked for a sign. And he says, well, no sign's going to be given this generation except the sign of Jonah. All right, with our conditioning, the only thing we know about the sign of Jonah is that he was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish. And then he was spit out, and that's a symbol of resurrection. Yes, that's true. That's absolutely right. Can you function with just that much information? Sure, no problem. But what if you knew the Agadah concerning the sign of Jonah? Well, if you'll remember, in 2 Kings chapter 4, there's the story there of the Shunammite woman. And remember, she's blessed with a son. She's been barren, but she's blessed with a son. Elisha, she builds this little prophet's house above her house for Elisha to stay. And so he blesses her, and she has a son, and then the son gets a bad headache one day and dies. And so she puts him there on the bed. She goes and she gets the prophet. She says, all is well. And Elisha goes eventually, and the boy is resurrected. The boy is never named. We just know her as the Shunammite woman. But in the Agadah, it tells us that the boy who was resurrected from the dead was Jonah. So, when Yeshua is speaking to a Jewish audience, and he's saying, I'll give you the sign of Jonah, in the Christian mindset, we say 3 days and 3 nights. And then the resurrection. To the Jewish mindset, who's familiar with this Agadah, that frames the way that they think about Scripture, and obviously the Pharisees have been using this Agadah as a proof text for the resurrection of the dead. The Sadducees would be dismissing it because they don't, it's just the first 5 books to them. But when he says the sign of Jonah to a Pharisee, who would use Agadah to support the doctrine of the resurrection, they're not just going to say, 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the earth, and then you're going to resurrect. In their mindset, they're saying, the sign of Jonah, you're going to resurrect. So sometimes this, it's not named. It doesn't tell you in the passage that, oh, and Yeshua told an Aggadic tale. It doesn't say that. But he does use the language of Agadah. That's going to be a mutual language that he understands with his listeners, especially if his listeners have been educated by the Pharisees. Because if they've been educated by the Pharisees and not the Sadducees, then they have a belief in the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead. They understand that the sign of Jonah is the resurrection of the dead. So they're actually getting more proof through Agadah than we're receiving just through the literal story of Jonah itself, Jonah the prophet. So I wanted to mention that, not necessarily as a people group, but as an influence that's working among certain people that explains, sometimes Yeshua will say things and it sounds a little oblique to us. And it's because it is oblique to us, because we don't know the Agadah, we don't know the explanatory story or the custom or the tradition that was taught by the Pharisees, and therefore we don't get the full impact of something such as the sign of Jonah. And that's especially true when we're reading a book like Revelation, which is full of tradition, Jewish tradition, that's grown out of those Torah portions. So we can miss a whole lot of good stuff in the book of Revelation by not knowing the Agadah or the Jewish tradition. Which goes back to, I can't say nice to see you again if I've never seen you before. So if we don't know the story, we can't say, oh, the sign of Jonah, he's talking about resurrection right there. So those are some of the major players, aside from the Pharisees. And in the next segment, what I want to do is to break down the two houses of the Pharisees, the house of Shammai and the house of Hillel, because these are going to get down to what we need to understand about the dynamics between these two groups and how Yeshua spoke into that.